So he's the author of two monographs, Northern Irish Poetry and Domestic Space, published in 2015, and Poetry, Politics and the Law in Modern Ireland, published in 2022. And his most recent book received an honorable mention in the 2023 Robert Rhodes Prize for Books on Literature, awarded by the American Conference for Irish Studies. He's also the co-editor of three collections, Architectural Space and the Imagination with Jane Griffiths in 2020, Law and Literature, The Irish Case with Eugene McNulty in 2022, and an anthology of ekphrastic poetry, The Echoing Gallery in 2013. He grew up in Ireland, the UK, and the USA and joined the School of English at UCC as a Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow in 2015. And before this, he taught in the English departments of Trinity College Dublin, the University of Aberdeen, and the University of Bristol. So thank you again, Adam, for being here with us tonight. And Adam's talk tonight is entitled Seamus Heaney's North Notebooks and Manuscript Drafts. Over to you, Adam.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Marion, and thank you for that really generous introduction. Thank you for all your help setting up this day in Paris. It's just delightful. And thank you to everyone for tuning in as well and listening to this research paper. I really appreciate your taking the time to do so. So hopefully you can see on the slides can you see the slides in front of you? Has that worked? Great. Okay, I'll carry on. The title of this talk, which is about Seamus Heaney's North Notebooks and Manuscript Drafts, North being that collection from 1975 that's attracted such fame and controversy. It's really a cornerstone collection of his, and his notebooks, which he donated to the National Library of Ireland in 2011. There's a photo of him doing so. They give a view of how this most controversial volume of his poems was composed, of the events and the world that shaped it, and of the roads the poet did not take. Heaney donated his literary papers to the National Library of Ireland in 2011, 2 years before his death. The collection is made up of 34 notebooks and thousands of manuscript pages and drafts from the early 1960s right the way up to the 2010s. The materials filed under North, they're the ones I'll be talking about today, and they give this really vivid snapshot of Heaney's intellectual life in the 1970s. They show evidence of the ambient pressures of the Vietnam War on Heaney's language and form. They hint at the possible influence on him, I think the underrated influence of the Anglo-Welsh modernist David Jones, and I'll talk about that. The notebooks also show that Heaney had this kind of oblique response to one of the most dangerous flashpoints of the Troubles. I'm talking about the Ulster Workers' Council General Strike of 1974, a moment when it really did seem as though Ireland was on the cusp of a new and terrible phase of civil war. So all these things are in the notebooks, and I'll be talking about things that are in these books and manuscript drafts. I'll be focusing on the things that are not in the poems. Because you kind of, by focusing on what's in the notebooks and not in the poems, you kind of come up with a map of the edge of the saleable. I'll argue for the significance of unpublished archive materials as a kind of parallel set of texts, ones that might help us to read the published poems, the canonical poems, anew. Okay, so far as the poetry of Seamus Heaney is concerned, we are in interesting times. In 2023, large selections of his letters and translations were published by Faber and Faber, edited respectively by Christopher Reid and Marco Sansoni. In 2025, the poems of Seamus Heaney came out with compendious notes by Bernard O'Donoghue, Rosie Lavin, Matthew Hollis. And this collected has over 200 poems that never saw publication in Heaney's canonical Faber volumes. And looking ahead, there is the forthcoming official biography of Seamus Heaney by Fintan O'Toole. So what I'll be arguing for is that looking into the archives can show readers who may not have ready access to these things how Heaney's canonical volumes and poems took shape. The text I'm talking about today, those manuscripts and notebooks in the National Library, add a National Library of Ireland, I should say, add a layer of granularity to what's in the published books, even though they remain unpublished. So what I'll just try and situate us in the atmosphere in which Heaney wrote North. The North manuscript materials are predominantly from a personal period of transition between North and South for Heaney. His moving across the border into the Republic with his family in 1972 wasn't just a matter of exchanging Ireland's northern jurisdiction for its southern one. It represented for Heaney a decisive moment of trust in his vocation as an artist because he was choosing this life of freelance writing over the security of lecturing, which he had known in Belfast. He would work on this project here in this house you can see pictured, down a heavily wooded road, edged by hedges and stone walls, heading uphill out of the small town of Ashford in the Wicklow Mountains, which is south of Dublin. The house to which he moved was rented to him by a Canadian Irish literature critic, Anne Sadelmeyer, and it was a very small one, 2 stories with an attic space Heaney used as a study. In the manner of estate cottages you can see all over Ireland, it's made of grey stone, it has red bricks surrounding its windows and doors. Moving here meant going from the dangers of living in Belfast, a city in the midst of a violent conflict, to this airy position in the mountains. "We're down in the cottage," Heaney wrote to a friend. "I'm upstairs, him in a room with a trunk lid fit and shaped to the ceiling, dry as snuff, looking out at ivy on the hawthorn and ferns and still ash trees." His writing from this time of the move shows him trying to work out if leaving Belfast had given him valuable freedom and perspective, or if it had robbed his work, conversely, of its insight and authenticity. His notebooks, like his letters, like indeed his collected poems, is evidence of Heaney's intermingled enchantment and misgiving at the move he had made. Both are evident in an untitled draft poem he wrote in one of the North notebooks, one that was never republished, and he reflects on the move. "We made a little jump at least and landed, for God's sake, in a beauty spot." So, in April 1974, I'll get to that in a minute. In April 1974, he was living at Glanmore Cottage, and Heaney started a new notebook. On its first page, he began drafting this review of David Jones, the Anglo-Welsh modernist poet. He began drafting a review of his last volume, which is called The Sleeping Lord and Other Fragments, which would appear in The Spectator. So he knew his handwriting review for publication. In his draft assessment of Jones's visionary Romano-Celtic collection, this is what Heaney had to say in his notebook. "If they are fragments," he wrote of the Sleeping Lord, "they are not of textile, but of stone. They have their weight and coherence. They allow us to project a wall or a column, for they are shaped by the pressure and the pattern of what has been withheld." So this passage, with its emphasis on what is not there in David Jones's work, reflects a preoccupation with absence on Heaney's part. At the time, Heaney was composing poems that he would publish in North, a collection that begins with the line, "There was a sunlit absence." I'll just show you the very first line of the dedicatory poem at the outset of North, Mossbawn, 2 Poems in Dedication. You can see that line, "There was a sunlit absence," is how it begins. Now, interestingly, because we can see the manuscript drafts, we can tell that that was actually that opening line was is in the presence of an absence of a few lines that he drafted. I've just written them there on the right-hand side of the slides, which he clearly then got rid of, so he could begin by pointing us towards absence. So one of the things that looking at the drafts does is it gives a layer of intentionality. It makes us see the roads that have not been taken and therefore hints at the importance and the significance of what is there. So as Heaney recognized of David Jones's work, in his own poetry at the time was shaped by the pressure of what had been withheld. The notebooks also include drafts or mentions of many poems that never saw the light of publication at all. Readers who are familiar with North are not familiar with poems with names like She Dreams Bogside, Her Nightmare Bestiary, She Dreams an Ulster Cenotaph, Turf Burning, Burning Turf. All of these things are either in the papers, they are in draft form, or they're listed in these speculative contents pages that Heaney was addicted to drafting. There was a time in Heaney's career where he could barely finish a poem without writing along the manuscript at the bottom the titles of works that he'd clearly been working on recently, trying to work out, it really looks like, where this latest work fits in this growing constellation that he was envisaging as forming his next collection. So as I say, this is going to be a paper about a few of the things Heaney did not say in North, at least. Just before I carry on, I just want to say something about what it's like to work on these materials. What's it like to work on the Heaney papers? Well, his handwriting is mercifully legible. It is often hasty, though. It's the corollary of a life spent in the midst of a phenomenal array of activities. The materials themselves are unassuming. They're workaday. Sometimes he wrote in loose leaf pads, sometimes hardbound or spiral bound foolscap notebooks. At times he used student workbooks ruled with square grids. Once he repurposed an address book as a poetry notebook. On at least a few occasions that have been preserved, he literally drafted poems on the backs of envelopes. There are many interpolated phone numbers and addresses. There's at least one shopping list. Heaney was also given to the occasional doodle. And looking ahead a few years from North, his children would actually come to commandeer pages from his notebooks for drawings and maps, and indeed an embryonic mock newspaper, heavily misspelled, named after their school, Conleth's Weekly, named after his son's school, St. Conleth's. So these notebooks are atmospheric mementos of the Heaney's domestic lives in the 1970s, that atmosphere out of which the poetry arose. The notebooks are also, though, a rich source of contextual materials for the volumes. Although the notebooks relating to North are filed by the National Library of Ireland under poetry, actually this distinction between genres in which Heaney worked is arbitrary. The North notebooks include drafts of introductions. We saw a book review, several book reviews, lectures, prose works. In fact, in the notebooks, the distinction between literature and whatever it is lies beyond literature are visibly, these distinctions collapse. There's an unfussy quality to his working materials that tells us something about Heaney's philosophy of composition. I mean, he told The Guardian in 2007 he had a superstitious fear of setting up a too well-designed writing place and then finding that the writing had absconded. His refusal to make too rarefied a place for poetry, either at his desk, and we can get an impression of that kind of provisional atmosphere in which he preferred to write. His refusal to make this rarefied place for poetry, either at his desk or in his notebooks, seems a response to me to the chanciness of poetry as an art form. As Heaney knew, poetry more than any other kind of writing is ultimately dependent on a grace that goes beyond calculations of effort and yield. There is no guarantee that this much work will produce that many lines of poetry. Heaney broadly subscribed to the idea that the arrival of lyric poetry is ungovernable. He wrote of it as a spurt of abundance from a source within that spills over to irrigate the world beyond the self. To imagine a life for oneself writing poetry, this freelance life that he moved over the border to Wicklow to pursue, is to really trust in recurrences and serendipities that are by their nature unwillable and mysterious. So work on other writing projects that I've been telling you about, the lectures, the book reviews, the essays, the introductions, the art catalogues. His notebooks suggest that all these kinds of work were how Heaney generated or perhaps attracted poems. The manuscript materials give readers the chance to look down, as I say, the roads Heaney didn't take as far as we can, and maybe look at some under-acknowledged influences. One model of resurrection from under the soil that Heaney read closely while he composed the Bog Poems of North was, as I say, The Sleeping Lord by David Jones. There's a perceptible thematic link between The Sleeping Lord and Heaney's Bogland poems in North. Jones's poems, like the ones in North, are phonic ones, although unlike Heaney's underground poems, David Jones's poems have their imaginative locus in the edges of the Roman Empire in Judea, on its eastern edge, and also in its western edge in Wales. These sort of the world of Romano-Celtic Britain. So in Heaney's book review of The Sleeping Lord, published in The Spectator in May 74, he interpreted David Jones's aim in digging beneath the soil as a salutary one. He called it Jones's effort to graft a healing tissue over the wound in English consciousness inflicted by the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. Heaney also writes of David Jones's creation that it affords a myth for an alternative society. It's often the case in a poet's book reviews that diagnosis raises the suspicion of self-diagnosis. So at the time, Heaney and David Jones were both part of this far-reaching constellation of Anglophone poets who were interested in a project of what you might call lexical archaeology. This is, I think, a sort of, for me, a useful quotation from a book about poetry in the 70s by Matthew Sperling. He called that book Visionary Philology. I mean, he's writing about Geoffrey Hill in the 70s, but what struck me about this passage is how relevant it is to a whole array of poets. Here's what Sperling wrote about Hill. This tendency in poetry, Hill wrote that poetry contributes to a sort of archaeological atlas of language, with semantic energy arising from the collisions and collusions of dialectical forms and standard ones. Like, spot on. That seems a good way of describing what David Jones was doing in Sleeping Lord. It seems like a good way of describing Heaney's North. As Jones said in the preface to his own Anathemata, we cannot answer the question, what is poetry, meaning what is the nature of poetry, without some engagement with the mythos, deposit, etc. There's a kind of recurrent quasi-shamanism in much English language poetry from the time of North, one energized by alternative societies that raise distant mythical memories from beneath the soil. In this worldview, repeatedly invoked in poetry from Britain and Ireland in the mid-20th century, really with its high point in the 1970s, the bones and stones beneath the soil are the earnest of the once and future world. These archaeological and prehistoric interests give physical expression to a widespread psychological movement, with its Jungian interest in the communal dream world of archetypes, its Freudian focus on uncovering the submerged pre-linguistic energies of interior life. Adrian Fraser, he's a critic who wrote a recent biography of Heaney's Ulster contemporary John Montague. And Fraser points out in his 2025 biography of John Montague that at this time, the 1970s, many poets, and this is a quote, educated themselves about archaic paths into the depths of human experience through dream, myth, drugs, music, even choric movement. These attempts to crack the topsoil of the self have archaeological concomitants. You can readily make that metaphor. But they also have a sort of taproot in these different national mythos. Think of Ted Hughes's Viking thistles as they emerge from deep beneath the earth of the English North, every one a revengeful burst of resurrection. Or when Geoffrey Hill, the English poet, presents a vision of the lineaments of ancient Mercia beneath the motorways and the housing estates of the modern Midlands. So what I'm trying to summon is something of that prevalent poetic atmosphere in which Heaney sat to write his review of David Jones as he was writing North. So Heaney wrote of David Jones, he has, in Eliot's phrase, returned to the origin and brought something back, something to enrich not only the language, but people's consciousness of who they have been and who they consequently are. As I say, it just seems Heaney might have been writing about himself or many of his contemporaries. Although Heaney's North has often been written about in its Irish context, in relation to the battlement pacing of Yeats in time of civil war, or with the earthy preoccupations of, say, Patrick Kavanagh, the notebooks carry evidence of these webs of influence that go beyond Ireland, in particular to this wider Irish-British psycho-archaeological impulse of the mid to late 20th century. It's a reminder that we are all more of our time than we are of any place. So, to Heaney, David Jones's The Sleeping Lord is an example of this positive project of restoration. But it's also oriented towards this project of resistance. From a Romano-Welsh perspective, David Jones's book is strongly concerned with the imperial centre's capacity to subjugate. In his review, Heaney quotes a section of The Sleeping Lord, and I'll just read to you a section of Jones's poetry that Heaney quoted. So here's what Heaney quotes. That modernity, here's the quote, has a tendency to square the world floor and number the tribes and write down the secret things and take away the diversities by which we are. In Heaney's reading of Jones, modernity is this process of squaring things off, one characterized by regimented systems that will collect and categorize information. In his view, this modern rule-making impulse might overwhelm and extirpate the vital, unrecorded subtleties of the world that preceded it. So there's this idea of poetry as the preserver and defender of evanescent and precarious realities. And this idea, of course, had a long heritage by the 1970s. In its echo-poetic lineage, it goes back to Wordsworth's Excursion, or further back to Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. In Ireland, it has a particular edge because it's related to that anti-colonial view of the world that animated the prophetic revolutionary mysticism of the Irish revival. It is the idea Yeats had in mind when he castigated the modern world, because it consisted of, there's a quote from Yeats, intelligible laws planned out on a great blackboard, a capacity for horizontal lines, for rigid shapes, for buildings, for attitudes of mind that could be multiplied like an expanding bookcase. That's from Yeats's essay, Wheels and Butterflies. What stands against the modern world is this memory of this earlier world of myth and magic. And this is what brings me back to Heaney there at his desk in 1974 in Glanmore, reviewing David Jones's The Sleeping Lord. So I'll show you a longer quotation. We know that Heaney read this passage closely because this is the passage he quoted from. So I'll just read you a bit of Jones's poetry, but before I do need to give you a glossary. Because that's the kind of linguistic archaeology he's engaged in. These words are not familiar to us. Okay, so the glossary is top line, Gleichschaltung, a German term kind of literally meaning single circuitness. It's particularly associated with the Nazi Party, and it comes from this idea that there is a single circuit with a single switch, and the Führer might flip the switch, and then the rest of society has to run along the electrical current that is provided, by the switch in the closed circuit. So that's what Gleichschaltung is, single circuitness. There is also, on the third line, a Gwydion hedge. Gwydion was a kind of trickster from Welsh mythology. So if you think of Puck in the English legendary tradition, or if you think of Anansi in the West African folkloric tradition, Gwydion is the kind of Welsh trickster equivalent. The Brunei on line 4 are hills, just a Welsh word for hills. And one more word on the next page, you're going to see the word minivers. And minivers are the white winter coats of squirrels. I was delighted to learn that word. I actually didn't know it existed until I started reading this poetry. So now you have your glossary. I can read the lines. In all times of Gleichschaltung, in the days of the central economies, set up hedges of illusion round some remnant of us. Twine the wattles of mist, white web, a Gwydion hedge, like fog on the brunei, against the commissioners and assessors bearing the writs of the ram, to square the world floor, and number the tribes, and write down the secret things, and take away the diversities by which we are, by which we call on your name, sweet Jill of the demarcations, ark of differences, tower of individuation, queen of the minivers, laughing in the mantle of variety. And sorry, I should have put on the next slide. So Heaney's interest in this litany might provoke us to look at the particularities of his own language in North in a new light. Heaney described the first part of North as being, quote, full of linguistic burr and clinker, great phrase, as he opposed to the more contemporary lexis of the volume's second part. The vocabulary of this first section bears out this description. If you read the first half of North, you're going to have to look up what is a glib or corbelled or turfcombe or bleb and so on. In this part of Heaney's work, we're in this non-standard linguistic register of Jones's Brunei, Gwydion, Minivers, and so on. It's not to say, of course, Heaney was learning this technique from Jones, but it does show us that at the time he was composing North, David Jones's book presented Heaney with a contemporary example of a technique he was pursuing. Just staying with this review, there's an interesting addition to Heaney's draft handwritten version, which is not, it's not in the handwritten version, and it is in the published version. I've been through line by line, just the notebook version, and then compared it to the printed version in The Spectator, and just to see where the differences are. And although Heaney had written, the draft handwritten review, it conforms pretty closely to the review he published in The Spectator in 1974. There is a line he added at the proofing stage. This is what he added when he got the proofs. These, that is Jones's poems, represent, as it were, the jungle's complaint to the napalm. And in some ways, late editions like these compel our attention, because they're often the most interesting thoughts because they are the last thoughts. They are the thoughts that the piece could not go out into the world without. So when Heaney writes of jungles and of napalm in 1974, we should remember, of course, at the time that images of US bombers incinerating huge tracts of Vietnam jungle had until recently been a staple of the nightly news. Can I just say that this places, for me, David Jones in this interesting new context? Because for me, as a kind of casual reader of his, he's a First World War poet. I think of him in terms of gas and trench and artillery. And it's a new experience to read him in the light of a B-52 incendiary attack. I feel this is a hint about how Heaney might justify his own linguistically innovative approach in North to himself. These odd words that he digs up represent a strange and resistant survival, even a growth, in the face of the kind of homogenizing violence that impelled the Vietnam War. So Vietnam, it appears in other ways in the North notebooks that are not at all evident in the book itself. There's a draft poem he has called The Water Babies, and it's not in the volume, but you can see Heaney is trying out a couple of lines that link poetic feet and marching boots. This is what Heaney writes in the draft notebook. You're so, and it gives me a problem because I have to somehow read aloud words that are crossed out. So I'm going to try and get around this formal problem by just reading the crossed out words quieter. Your soldiers march, military hexameters. Your soldiers strike hexameters. Off local roads, I can sniff the hygienic steam of bath houses. The politics of poetic form, the pentameter, the hexameter, these are always an element of Heaney's thinking, but they're especially present in the North notebooks. Heaney's attempt to deploy the word hexameters to maximum effect are audible here. He's trying it out in different ways and places. The metrical term in these draft lines is yoked to a mysterious reference to soldiers. Who are these soldiers? These men are possibly far from home because they're on local roads, like which locals? The image of troops deployed by the order of a distant power is indeed one that haunts Heaney's writing, but there's a whiff of steam in these writings that might be from the bathhouse of any barracks, but steam in particular, for me, especially in the light of his references to napalm and jungle, for me, they evoke or hint at the climate of Southeast Asia, perhaps. In any case, the lines I have quoted here enact this long-standing linkage in Heaney's imagination between the military and the metrical. I'm just going to quote from Heaney's essay, Extending the Alphabet, because he writes about these exact links between the sort of march of military feet and the feet of the English pentameter line as it marches across the page. In this published essay, yes, okay, it's called Extending the Alphabet. It's about Christopher Marlowe. He observes the English pentameter marched in step with the invading English armies of the late Tudor period, the metrical concomitant of a historical effort to create a New England and a London Derry. In the same essay, he sees the English pentameter as kin to the Virgilian hexameter, recording that the latter is heroic, the poetry of the imperial center, the meter in which Virgil wrote the Aeneid, a poem which envisaged Rome's divinely ordained global conquest, the spread of its civilization. So Heaney's deployment, conversely, of these attenuated 2 and 3 beat lines, the so-called skinny stanza, they've been called by Edna Longley. His deployment of these short lines dates from his earliest published collection, but they do gain a particular prominence among the lunar whisperings of Wintering Out from 1972 and from the blood-scented soil of North in 1975. So I just think it's useful to be reminded of the politics of poetic form, which may be in lines that weren't in the book themselves, but were clearly, they hinted the ideas that were active in his imagination as he composed the volume. So the skinny stanza, let's turn to the kind of opposite of these long pentameter or hexameter lines. The skinny stanza is visible in another handwritten draft among the manuscript pages. This is a draft poem he labeled Mossbourne 1, the Townland as poem. Mossbourne was the farmhouse where he was first born, thatched, whitewashed, almost sort of archetypally Irish rural cottage. Woolstead of words, white moss, bog fortress, memories, doodle, meters, traditional forms cancelled, old-fashioned, indigenous meter, strict as thatch edging whitewash or the drill's cicatrice. In the draft quoted above, amid lines that go between 2 and 3 strong beats, the word indigenous meter, or rather the phrase indigenous meter, is boxed. This meter is associated with the materials and methods by which the thatched whitewashed cottage at Mossbourne was constructed. So these unpublished poems, with their focus on meter, are reminders just of the associations in Heaney's mind between the long line and the imperial, Alexandrine the Great, you might say, and therefore they remind us of the potential anti-imperial ethics of that skinny stanza. So I'm just trying to point out some of the ways in which looking at this peripheral supporting unpublished material might just allow us to read his published works in a new light. Okay. There are other hints of North Vietnam in the North papers as well, though not in the volume North. There's an unpublished prose piece, which is based on his early memories that he writes in the notebooks. It's called The Childhood of Antaeus, Antaeus being this god of the earth and the soil that he's written about in other places. So in The Childhood of Antaeus, he's writing about his own childhood, but he also, for reasons that are not at all clear to me, writes the word next to the title paddy fields, and then he draws like a box around it. Now, paddy fields, it sort of resonates in an Irish and in a Southeast Asian context as well, places of rice cultivation. So let's pause for a moment just to put these fragments from the notebooks together. Napalm jungle, paddy fields, soldiers moving through steamy environments. These were all in his mid-1970s writings, in his imagination, and we can tell from the notebooks. But none of these things are in North. So in spite of the absence of explicit reference to the conflict in the volume, I'm just going to suggest that the traces and pieces we can glean from his notebooks suggest the atrocities committed in the war on North Vietnam are alive in Heaney's mind as he composed North, the volume. It's almost as if the atmosphere of his time is trapped in that microweave of pages like pollen grains, if you put an electron microscope on the pages themselves, of the notebooks where Heaney composed. And in a way, that presence of Vietnam in his imagination, it's kind of unsurprising, you know, in the light of his stay in that epicenter of US radicalism, Berkeley University, San Francisco, the early 70s. I mean, years ago, Blake Morrison suggested Heaney's experiences in Berkeley engendered a more critical approach to Northern Ireland, absolutely. But it's in the notebooks, I feel, we can almost see this process at work. So let's turn from Vietnam to Ireland. In another unpublished poem in the collection, the manuscript collection. Heaney almost is giving us a hint in this poem I'm about to show you, again, never republished, that we should be alert and alive to the possible presence of violence, even in these rural, bucolic poems that celebrate his new arrival in this mountainy, airy perch in the mount above Dublin. This is a poem. I quoted a line at the start of this talk. I'll just show you the rest of what he wrote. We made a little jump at least and landed, for God's sake, in a beauty spot. Is it worth it to end up with toute la reste? I don't think I'd have ended up being shot. He means had he stayed in Belfast, I think. For all the melodrama of, and then stereophonic nightmare. He's quoting from a poem about the Troubles by a friend of his, Michael Longley, a Belfast poet. So that line links us back to Belfast in two ways. He's both thinking of the place and also of a friend who has stayed, Michael Longley. For all the stereophonic nightmare, the threatening phone calls, the door-to-door gunmen, the situation with its death mark stare persists inside the skull beneath the skin. I find the closing two lines there particularly interesting as a kind of hint from Heaney of how we should read the poetry of this beauty spot, that the situation, which he often uses as a euphemism to describe the troubles, the violence, persists as the skull beneath the skin. So what's odd is that there are examples of that process at work. Let's have a look at that skull beneath that skin. Here's the example. Okay, I'll just have to talk you through it a bit. It's a draft dated the 15th of May, 1974. He didn't usually date his drafts. He does here. I'll get back into that. It's dated 15th of May, 1974, and it's in Notebook 2. And here are the words that he wrote. Crepuscular breezes, crepuscular unease, crepuscular unease. To what? To whom? Analogues, literacies, the act of night, breeze. It feels almost suitable reading these lines that I'm speaking from just above Samuel Beckett's old haunt in the Rue Saint-Jacques, because there's a hauntingly Beckettian tone to this notebook draft. Heaney didn't always or even often record, as I say, the dates in his notebooks, but he did so much more frequently than normal in the last 2 weeks of May 1974. The 15th of May 1974, which he records there, is a historic date in the history of modern Ireland. It is the first date of the Ulster Workers' Council general strike. And during the 2 weeks that followed, there were fears a full-scale civil war might erupt out of that smouldering, low-intensity civil conflict, the Troubles, as loyalists blockaded the streets of Northern Ireland, shut down supplies of food, fuel, and electricity. So in order to protest against a combined unionist, nationalist, power-sharing administration called the Sunningdale administration of 1974, loyalist workers who wanted to maintain the tie to the United Kingdom launched a general strike that saw 2 weeks of increased violence, rallies, power cuts, blocked roads, industrial shutdowns, really the whole machinery of society grinding to a halt amid a sort of ramping up of violence, of intimidation. This went along, and then this was followed by the subsequent collapse of the Sunningdale Agreement, which had attempted to institute power sharing amid unionists and nationalists of a kind that's currently in place. And 2 days after, Heaney wrote these lines, 2 days after the launch of this general strike. 33 people were killed by loyalist bombs in the Republic, an event Heaney recalled even 2 decades later in his Nobel speech. So out of these notes that I showed you, crepuscular breezes, crepuscular unease, are the beginnings of Heaney's Glanmore Sonnets 3, which he eventually published in his next collection but one. He published these things in 1979 in his collection Fieldwork. So in the Glanmore Sonnets section of Fieldwork, Heaney celebrates his arrival in this new location in Ashford, Glanmore Cottage. But he also intimates, as he wrote in those unpublished lines, the skull beneath the skin. He intimates that he sees his new surrounds through the lens of that violent place that he has left. So I'll just show you, I showed you this first go, this kind of attempt to chart the sonic curve. And then on the next page, he writes a heading, Ashford, which must be just a placeholder title. It's the name of the nearest town to the cottage he was in. This evening, the cuckoo and the corncrake, too much, too something, I kid you not, consorted at twilight. It was all pastoral, elegy, and iambic. Out in the field, a baby rabbit took his bearings, and I knew the deer. I've seen them too, from the window of this house, like connoisseurs inquisitive of air. Were careful under larch birch and May green spruce. I had said earlier, I won't relapse from this strange loneliness I've brought us to, and then cancelled. Blood will have blood while John Bull taps. Now, those words, blood will have blood, and the mention of John Bull, a traditional metaphor for England, take the poem in a very different direction from the one on which it started. And Heaney pursues this new note as he continues his draft down the same page. These are some of the lines he sketches out. Blood will have blood. I sniff the active breeze. Not to put a foot wrong, I sniff the breeze. Self-consciousness, to stand and sniff the breeze. The house is an ear, stiff in the night breeze. You can hear the sounds Heaney wanted to make, I feel. It's almost as if he has a sonic route in his mind that he wants to follow, and the words are like the stepping stones he lays out along that route. You can see how sniff and stiff kind of chime with each other, or breeze and unease. There's clearly certain sounds he wanted to put in there. And indeed, he does get these sounds in there, although those kind of paranoiac and blood-scented elements are taken out of the final poem. When he comes to publish it in 1979, it's in the bucolic selection of sonnets, the Glanmore Sonnets. So this is just most of the final poem. It's all I could fit on the slide. This evening, the cuckoo and the corncrake, so much too much, consorted at twilight. It was all crepuscular and iambic. Out on the field, a baby rabbit took his bearings, and I knew the deer. I've seen them too from the window of the house, like connoisseurs inquisitive of air. Were careful under larch and May green spruce. Outside, a rustling twig combing breeze refreshes and relents, is cadences. And knowing now how the poem was composed, we can perhaps read some of these lines that we see anew. The words like consorted almost hint at sort of criminal association. Words like you can see a certain maybe level of paranoia in that it's all about who is viewing or who is watching whom. I knew the deer. I've seen them too. They seem almost like suspects. Were careful getting their bearings. Again, maybe hints of Heaney's own kind of precarious position as a public figure in a time of widespread conflict. This idea of May Green's Bruce Green has been a signal in Irish poetry of Republican revolution since long before Yeats told us that wherever green is worn, it's changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And of course, there's May, the month in 1974 of the Ulster Workers' Council general strike, even though he doesn't tell us this openly. So, first of all, I think it allows us to see this bucolic poem in a new light, maybe read it anew. Secondly, what I find so interesting are the consistent elements. As I say, those sounds that were in Heaney's mind from the outset, unease, breeze, it's there in the closing couplet, sniff and stiff have gone, but the sound is there in twig and is, again in that closing couplet. So Heaney's kind of sonic imperatives in composition are brought to the surface when you see the kind of drafts that his poems are made out of. So you can see that by the time Heaney published the poem, way later, 1979, the winds had shifted. It's a different kind of piece from the one he was drafting in 1974. So the poem that came out of the drafts was at odds not only with its own beginnings, but with the terrible times out of which it sprung. And this indicates an approach to poetry that is not only imagistic, it's really consciously oriented against the prevailing winds of reality. The imagination pressing back against the pressures of reality is one definition of poetry. It's Wallace Stevens' definition. Heaney quoted that a lot. You'll see it a lot in his interviews. Interestingly, he also said that in his imagination, Glanmore Cottage itself represented what Stevens said poetry was, the imagination pressing back against the pressures of reality. So there's this kind of resistant quality in the place itself. When Heaney saw Ireland on the verge of a new phase of conflict in the 1970s, he wrote, what is on the surface at least, of what was crepuscular and iambic in the Wicklow Mountains around him. Although we now know, because we are alerted to the significance of his form, that when he points out the iambic, we cannot read that in outside its imperial context. Indeed, elsewhere in North, he writes of how iambic drums of English sweep the woods. So even though iambic is traditionally associated with say, love poetry or with what is associated with nature, we should be on the alert, like the deer in his poem, when we see that word iambic. So this approach to poetry, it's not so much escapist as it is many-minded and restorative. It's an attempt to double the focus, to rebalance what is out of kilter. However, with the knowledge of the time it's written, which come from his notebooks, as I say, we can just read this poem in a new slant of light amid the calamitous events of May 1974. The May Green of Glanmore sonnets take on a new resonance. Again, there are gleams and glimmers in the notebooks that can help us read even well-known poems anew. And I think that's important. Just trying to summarize with a few thoughts. I might just sort of draw to a close in the next few minutes. But I think that's important with Heaney's poetry. I am a big admirer that idea that we must read them anew, because one of the problems that Heaney's great and justified fame has brought is that certain cliched modes of reading have entered into the discussion of his work. And you can see this because AI knows them. And AI is the kind of scoured edges of the critical mind. It's what is thrown up out of a whole knot of the world's cliches. And so it has given us, and I know this because I mark work on Heaney, it has given us certain fixed and stereotypical ways of reading Heaney. And so one of the advantages that we have as human critics over AI is that it doesn't have hands. It cannot get a library card. It cannot go into the archive. So I think, as I say, it's necessary for us to find new ways of reading these poems. I'm a big admirer of the playwright Brian Friel, who is a friend of Seamus Heaney's, also from the northwest of Ireland. And and Friel ends his famous play translations from the early 1980s, saying that we must never cease to renew our images or they fossilize, and that images of the past as they are represented in language are what matter most. He's kind of borrowing from George Steiner, but I think this idea of the necessity of refreshing the language by which we speak of things is it's a salutary reminder. Even though, okay, both of the poems that I showed you most recently, the one about we took a little jump and landed in a beauty spot, and this one here, the poem that began crepuscular unease, neither of these pieces made it into North, even though they're in the North notebooks. So this holding back of, well, the disappearance of one poem reminds us of, how much else is out there of Heaney's work. But the holding back of this poem, the one you can see in front of you until 1979, is a reminder that the chronology suggested by Heaney's volumes, which poems were published in 1972's Wintering Out, which ones were published in 1975's North, and so on and so on. This chronology doesn't necessarily reflect the chronology of their composition. If Heaney might publish a poem years, sometimes decades after writing this, and I've seen it. The longest I've seen, the longest lag from the North notebooks to a published poem is about 26 years. I've seen a poem in the North notebooks that I recognized from his 2001 collection, Electric Light. So it changes the question that we ask when we approach a poem of his in a volume. The question is not so much when it comes as why there. It's a reminder of the conscious artistry, this obsessive constellation making between his poems that he was engaged in. A reminder that, as Hugh Kenner observed of Yeats, he didn't accumulate poems, he constructed books. The many-mindedness of Heaney's poetry, which I hope I've just illustrated in some small way, that capacity for second thoughts, is one of its chief qualities. Helen Wendler structured her book on Heaney around the theme of second thoughts, describing in each chapter how Heaney revisits and revises his earlier preoccupations. Indeed, near the outset of Heaney's career, Terence Brown, in the first book chapter about his work, it was Terence Brown's book Northern Voices from 1975, he remarked very presciently that Heaney's poetry is a remarkably skilled, compelling, poetic organization of his indecision. And what fascinates me so much about the notebooks is that you can see the options laid out, and therefore it lends an additional significance to the route that was followed. One of the main insights Heaney's notebooks can provide is into his drafting processes, how he deleted, added, his redrafts. The comparison of published poems with their draft incarnations allows readers to focus on moments of decision and to consider the poems that might have been before Heaney committed one version to the eternity of print. And so this actually is linked to how I'm pursuing this project in the light of modern manuscript studies. I'm very interested in the work on genetic criticism by the critic Dirk van Hulle, and he has this idea of the manuscript not as a kind of originary moment, an ur-text, something that might point us towards a truth that was buried in the act of revision and so on. He doesn't want to make this link between authenticity and draft work, which I think is absolutely right. Rather, he encourages us to see the draft as a parallel text, something that we might reread the published text in the light of, one piece of evidence among many in our interpretations. So the notebooks and manuscript revisions give readers ways of seeing the otherwise invisible pressures and considerations that formed Heaney's work. And as such, as I say, these drafts are parallel texts. They give readers insights into how Heaney worked, into the times in which he lived. And I will stop speaking there, but I just want to thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to discussing this with you if anyone would like to discuss it with me. But for now, thank you. Thanks.
Much, Adam.
Thank you. I can see and not hear applause, but I appreciate that. It's nice to see. It's nice to see. Thank you. Get some water. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam. So perhaps quit the share mode.
Yeah, I'll quit share mode now if I can. Stop share. There we go. How's that?
So thank you very much, Adam, for this very rich and fascinating talk. So I'm sure we all have many, many questions, and it's really hard to know where to begin. I had just a very simple question to begin with. Um, did you actually? So, I guess you actually went yourself to the library to have a look at
I
the.
constantly. I mean, one of the sort of, one of the great elements of luck in all this is I find these notebooks fascinating, but I can also cycle about 25 minutes and get to them back and forth. So yeah, I've sort of regularly haunted these things, looking over my shoulder, almost going, why isn't everybody looking at these? These are amazing. So, but yeah, I had, and again, I had the great luck of just having a 6 month sabbatical period, which I've just come off, and so I had some time to yeah just get to know the notebooks. Yeah.
And so I was wondering, why did you choose North in particular?
Okay, I began just with a survey of everything that was there. I went through the notebooks, and in a way, there's no way I could have done that. I just wanted to know what was there, and so it was quite a quick process. There was huge reams of material. I kind of just flipped through. What I was hoping to get at is what grabbed me, and I maybe found five or six of those moments where where just something about his style of composition, the elements that were there, there was just something that particularly hooked me. And it just so happens one of those five or six was from North. And then there's the element of chance. I was doing this all in 2025. 50th anniversary of North. And so the sort of ambient pressure in the academy was to find things to say about North. And it just so happened that like I'd found, so there's, as always in research, there's a combination of will and chance. And I think both of those things came together. But I think, yeah, the just the sheer chronological fact of the brute chronological fact of the 50th anniversary, I think has something to do with that. I mean, I've done other work on other notebooks, but yeah, that's the one I thought I'd show you today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Um, do we have questions from the audience? And you can write in the chat too if you want. Virginie.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. And I have two questions because I remember seeing the manuscripts
Mm.
for North when I was writing my master's, and I remember that. Um, well, I didn't know anything about genetic criticism, and I remember that a lot of them were undated, as you said, and I wondered how you went about solving that problem. And my second question is. Um, well, I guess what I was struck by with the notebook and the manuscripts and what you talked about today as well um, is how much of the invisible pressures are ethical pressures and how you can see the revisions in some of the poems are ethical revisions as well as aesthetical or poetical revisions.
That's such a good question. I'm going to have to think about that for a second. Ethical revisions. Now, just clarify, is there any poem in particular you're thinking of, or any
Well, I
how
remember the one that struck me was punishment because there's
Yes. And you know what? I'm still, there are so many layers and levels to that. And it's such a new project. I didn't really want to even go into that here. And you're absolutely right that punishment, which maybe not everyone here knows if they're not an Irish poetry specialist, it's a particularly controversial poem. It both relates to a bog body and imagines the circumstances of what the poet imagines as the sacrificial death of this woman in Iron Age Germany. And then it links her fate to those of contemporary women in Northern Ireland punished by Republicans for relationships with British soldiers. And I'd say the voyeurism perhaps of this, and the confessed voyeurism of this poem is one of the many elements which has led to it being very harshly criticized by Heaney's peers. So I just thought I'd bring people up to speed, because I'm really interested in hearing hearing what you say about that. I do want to answer both questions, but I just wanted to almost kind of clarify. Okay, so tell me what you found in that North draft. I'm just curious yeah.
Well, I remember thinking at the end, because it's such a controversial poem, that Heaney went through so many stages himself regarding his own stance and the stance of the tribe, so what he calls the tribe, and the girl as well. And I think there's a version, but I don't know because they're undated. I don't know if that is a first version, but I know that there's a version from the girl's point of view as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, this is all right. Okay, and okay, I might try and answer those questions. Where to begin though? I'll begin just because we're in the middle of the conversation already. I'll begin by talking about these ethical revisions, which, yeah, I now see exactly why you call them that. And then I'll go on to this problem of dating. Okay, so just to start with these ethical revisions, what's so interesting about Heaney's revisions is how often the revisions that he makes will bring in another, it'll keep the original meaning and it'll bring in another perspective at the same time. As I say, this kind of multiplication of meaning was clearly part of his revision processes. Now, punishment represents a particularly intense and fraught category of or example of Heaney's revisions. And yeah, as I say, there are many versions, and to be honest, the more I read them, the more mysterious it gets. Okay, so just to give a few examples of some of the revisions that went into punishment before that final published version in 1975. There is a version, as you say, which much more foregrounds the woman at the poem center. As I say, this body was found, it was called the Vindeby Girl. Nobody really knew who she was. It was found in this bog in northern Germany, hence the name. She was written about, or this body was written about in a book of archaeology, The Bog People by P.V. Glob, and then Heaney read The Bog People and was prompted to write his own poetic response to her death, although this response changes as he goes through the different drafts. So he focuses not on how he looks at her, which is, as you say, what the end result is. That's what the published poem is, and that's why it's so controversial. He publishes on her looking out. He focuses on her looking out in one of the drafts. I remember the line, and I don't have the draft in front of me, but just from my memory, an early draft has the words, "She outstares all of us." So the idea, and so it completely it doesn't have at all that kind of weird confessional ending where he says, "I understand the tribal instinct to, purify the tribe, which led to this girl's death," which is what he says in the final version. He doesn't say that. He says, "She stands in judgment. She is looking at us. She outstares us all." And that was one version. He has a little handwritten note on that version saying this is about a body found in Room Fen in East Denmark. But that is not the Vindeby Girl of North Germany. So the location of the body has changed. It's absolutely baffling. He was clearly working with an image rather than a set of historical facts. Because as it turns out, they've done, and tell me if you know this already, I might just say this for everyone else's benefit, about the DNA tests done on that body called the Vindeby Girl. Have you heard about this? Or cool.
It's a man.
It was a man, that's right. It was the body was the body of a man who probably died of natural causes. These DNA tests were taken in 2010. And so in a way that shows that it shows that we shouldn't be intimidated by what are called the hard sciences, because what do they know? This archaeologist had wrote, this is the Vindeby Girl, and these are the ritual tribe purifying conditions out of which he was killed. But actually, neither were true, it looks like. So then Heaney was led by the best science at the time, which was that book, The Bog People. And but on the other hand, we can't then, I think, associate this poem too closely with the body of Vindeby simply because he points to another bog body in one of the drafts. And then, as I say, the original draft, it's much easier to swallow. The original draft is here is this body of this woman who's been sacrificed, and yet because she's been preserved, she stands in eternal judgment. She outstares us all. Compare that to 1975. I connive in civilized outrage, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I who have stood mute while your betraying sisters, cold in tar, wept by the railings, who understands the exact and tribal intimate revenge. Which, yeah, is you're out in this space of interstellar cold. The confession is and so it becomes much more confessional. It becomes a much more problematic poem. And so, yeah, it just shows, in a way, that poem attracted outrage. But what's interesting about the drafts is it showed that he went out to meet that outrage. He actually had versions which wouldn't have prompted the response that poem did. So yeah, the ethical revisions are in some ways unethical revisions. Like they are there to almost make him the bad guy, as it were, to show up these tendencies which are atavistic, voyeuristic, uncomfortable. So yeah, I think we have this idea of Heaney as this kind of national uncle, this kind of comfortable, lovable figure. But yeah, I think that the papers, they just complicate the story. And sorry, I just want to just pause for a moment and see if you want to, because you also asked about this question of dating, but I realize I've been going on for a while. So if you have any comments to make that are further, or if anybody else that wants to jump in, please do.
No, thank
Okay.
you so much.
So, yeah,
That's so interesting. Thank you.
oh, that's okay. Yeah, I'll just go on to your second point. You asked about the dating, and yeah, he didn't often date things. Absolutely. You just have to deal with them as they are. Some amazing criticism has been done recently. I don't know if you've seen the collected poems published by Faber, edited by Bernard O'Donoghue, Matthew Hollis, Rosie Lavin. They have gone into the history of Heaney's typewriters, and they know the dates that he changed from one typewriter to the other. So there is some, kind of CSI level forensics, and it's why these collected poems are such a gift. The scholarship is absolutely colossal, and I've the greatest respect for it. And so, these questions hopefully have been, we at least have little hints. But you're right, a handwritten draft, he often didn't date things. Because I can't change it, I guess what I've come to appreciate is that very often when Heaney writes a date on something, it means something. The fact that he wrote the 15th of May, 1974, when he didn't often write dates, means that, clearly he at that moment could see himself as a kind of historical actor or a historical subject. And I think that in itself is interesting. So yeah, just try and learn to accept the things I can't change about the manuscripts, I guess is all I can do. Thanks for the question. Really fascinating couple of questions, and thank you for asking as well.
Thank you so much for your very generous answers. Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Or maybe in the chat? I had a question, Adam, about you mentioned at the end of the talk genetic criticism and your growing interest in genetic criticism. And we have here Flavie Epier, who's our own specialist of genetic criticism. Well,
Paper last week was terrific. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that.
especially.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you might tell us a little bit more about, the insights of genetic criticism and how you would like perhaps to insert them in your project and on Heaney's manuscripts.
Sure. I mean, this is, and again, this is something I'm interested in getting other people's insights from. So if Flavie, you want to just jump in at any moment, I'd really appreciate what you have to say on this exact topic. I think, okay, so my thinking on this, and this is all quite, it's all quite new territory for me, just the idea of manuscript studies. And so the sort of critics who I've found useful are, as I said, I've mentioned Dirk van Hulle as well, and I've also found very useful a critic called Catherine Sutherland, who wrote a book called Why Modern Manuscripts Matter. And really, just to kind of, I guess, just to paraphrase, one of the things that that they are keen to debunk is this idea that there is a more authentic draft out there. That actually, if you dig beneath the sort of layers and layers, you might come across this sort of pure original thought, uncontaminated by the obfuscatory impulses of revision. And that's just been salutary, I think, that you actually aren't, it's not like the true cross. You're not finding the true version. Rather, you're being given, almost distorting mirrors, kind of parallels and twins, just these texts which are like it, but not the same as it. And yeah, these are, I find them so interesting. Just to say, to ask myself the question, why this and not that? Why did it turn out published in this version and not the one that he tried out on the page? So yeah, to see them, as I say, just as prompts for thought rather than as the Holy Grail, I guess is the key message I've taken from modern manuscript studies. But as I say, I know that this is really in Flavie's wheelhouse, and so yeah, if you've anything to contribute, I'd really appreciate hearing it.
Flavie, do you want to add something?
So
No, I completely agree with what Adam said. And again, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. Yeah, I think the idea of variant texts and the notion that we also have to deal with the gaps between those versions and how to make sense of those variants and is very interesting, and of the question of the status of the drafts and the variants as well. Of course, I don't know much about the material you're working with, but maybe one question that I have, which is very tangential to what you were saying, is what you mentioned doodles.
Oh yeah.
And I was wondering if those doodles served a particular purpose in Heaney's creation
Oh gosh,
process.
so interesting. I'm trying, do you know what? And I haven't been stopping to kind of log or categorize them or whatever. I've noticed them when they're there, but I haven't really kind of given them the status that maybe I should. They tend to be pretty abstract. They tend to just be shapes that he makes with his pen. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I can even show you pictures because different manuscripts are in different states of availability. And the way that the Heaney manuscripts work is that you need permission from the estate. And I will be eventually applying for that permission, but I almost want to do it in one go. So whereas I can type that and try and reproduce as best as I can on the slides, because these are unpublished materials, I actually need to go through the formalities and the procedures before I can show you anything. But yeah, I'm thinking of little things. They look a bit like staircases. They look a bit like sheaves of wheat. They aren't as complex or even as obsessive as the wonderful ones I've seen in Samuel Beckett's papers. I don't know if you've ever seen Samuel Beckett's kind of meditation. They're light shadow corners, staircases repeated again and again. I absolutely love the look of those things. There's nothing of that kind of Lakean neurosis, I want to call it, in Heaney's in Heaney's manuscripts. In a way, some of the most interesting drawings aren't by him. They're actually by clearly a child who has climbed up, and drawn like a face or a fake newspaper or a map, or like tried to create this kind of world or kingdom. So clearly the chief doodlers in his notebooks are his children. But yeah, I think that there's a sense in the doodles that they look to me kind of ways of passing the time. There doesn't look to be anything in particular that is being worked out that I've seen. If that, yeah, but no, it's a really useful reminder to pay attention to the doodles, because I hadn't even. I mean, is this? Yeah, this is an interest of yours? Yours.
No, I was actually thinking of Samuel Beckett's
Yeah, I was thinking
doodles.
yeah, no. Yeah, no, there's not. I mean, they deserve a whole exhibition of their own. Unfortunately, yeah, there's no equivalent I can. I mean, what he tended to do, like if he was giving a friend a book and there was like an illustration in the book, he'd do some kind of speech bubble out of their mouth with some sort of in-joke with that friend. So he was much more inclined to kind of scroll and disfigure other people, just as a kind of social thing than he was to, as I say, undertake that sort of Beckettian project of the staircases to nowhere.
Thank you.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Marion, you're muted.
Thank you. Sophie, I think you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. So thank you so much, Adam, for such an interesting presentation. I wrote my master's thesis on Seamus Heaney in 1999. It was on poetic parole in Seamus Heaney's poetry. It was a long time ago, and the building in front of Trinity College that pays tribute to Seamus Heaney did not exist at the time. We called Seamus Heaney in 1999 a poet farmer. Do you think that today we would call him an eco-poet?
That's yeah, it's a really interesting question. I do. It's like Auden said. What is it? The poets are modified in the guts of their readers. That actually their true afterlife is in the words we choose to call them. Um, yeah, he survives in the Valley of Unknowing. Yeah, I do. I think you can. I think it's possible to make that case. I think it's also I can see ways in which things that sort of act against that designation. But can we call him an eco-poet? You can look, for example, at I mean, some of the poems very much suggest that. I'm thinking of a poem like Moyala from his late collection. It's from District and Circle, 2006. And he revisits a much more troubles-inflected poem. He wrote a poem called Moyola in the 19, or sorry, a poem about the Moyola, Gifts of Rain. He wrote that in the 1970s about the Moyola River. This river flows by his house. It's clearly, it talks about things like blood music and history. It's clearly there in the Troubles context. The landscape and the water are seen in the midst of this controlling Troubles metaphor. And that's how he saw the Moyola River. 2006, he rewrites it. Moyala, what is it? It's pearls, it's pebbles, slicked and blurred, a muddying of the vowel Moyola to Moyala. And he says it himself in an interview he did a year later with Dennis O'Driscoll in Stepping Stones. He says that the 2006 version is much more alive to green issues, the contamination of the river. And he says, and therefore its drift is political. And just that changing of the meaning of the word political, a Heaney political poem in the 70s was, in its Troubles context, a Heaney political poem in 2006 was, according to him, an eco poem. So we can certainly see that shift in emphasis and tendency. Then beyond that body of late work, which is consciously inclined towards the ecological, beyond that, we have to it then becomes a matter of what you're willing to call ecological. I'll give you an example of this. Because he was clearly really interested in, for example, just the natural world itself, the earth, the soil, the hills, the rivers, the waters, and so on. So take a poem like Antaeus and what's it called now? Hercules and Antaeus, where Antaeus is the god of the soil. Again, the colonial controlling metaphor is there. Hercules, the god of civilization, overthrows Antaeus, the god of the landscape. Would you, even though that colonial metaphor is clearly there, is it also an eco-poem because it speaks up for Antaeus? Or is it not an eco-poem because the colonial context obviates those ecological elements? I don't know how to make that argument, So is he an eco-poet? It depends how we want to read those early works. I mean, I'd almost want a canvas for opinions on this. What do you think?
Well, one of the criteria in eco-criticism to belong to that trend is also to write something that raises people's awareness as to all the catastrophes mankind has been going through. I'm not sure Seamus Heaney is actually emphasizing this completely.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually. Yeah, because although he is interested in the natural world, as you say, if you are going to define eco-poetry as concerned with sort of human-provoked calamity, then I mean, it does enter into his poetry, but you have to wait until really the end of the Troubles for it to do so in any significant way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question.
Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. That's been a pleasure.
You have other questions? Other comments?
I believe that's nice. Someone's reading nice comments.
No, I just perhaps had one last comment to make. I mean, I was struck with what he said about, when he fled. Well, yes, he fled in a way to the Republic and to Glenmore Lodge in County Wicklow, and what you said about the tribe, how he speaks about the tribe, and this made me think of Derek Mahon's poem, "The Last of the Fire Kings."
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
When he says that, that he, either way, I'm through with history. Last of the Fire Kings, I shall break with tradition. And then he, in the end, he says, but the fire-loving people, rightly perhaps, will not countenance this, demanding that I inhabit like them a world of sirens, bin lids, and brick windows. So, as we mentioned a couple of days ago together, Mahon decided later on to retreat to Kinsale, and so not to the mountains, but to the coast, to the coastline. And I was wondering, yes, we also mentioned Michael Longley with Carrick-Skeowan in County Mayo, so another kind of wilderness. So I think there might be some interesting things to be said, perhaps, about this kind of, retreating of the last of the Fire Kings, if you want, those three poets retreating to different places and different types of nature at the same time of environments. So I was wondering if if you had something to say about this, because I think the comparison is quite interesting.
I'd add other points to that map that you sort of so knowledgeably created. I think that's absolutely right. That tendency that you spotted. So there's Derek Mahon looking out over the water and out on Kinsale on the coast, Heaney in the mountains at Glanmore, Michael Longley in Carrick-Skeowan. You might also think of Maeve McGuckin up in her cottage, looking out over the sea in Fairhead. Maybe a less read poet nowadays, but Richard Murphy and the cottage he created out in the west in this other life that he had out towards Inishbofin. So there's there is a marked tendency that is frankly too prevalent to be coincidental. I think that's right. And sometimes in my head, I link it back to that Aire example of Yeats making his tower this kind of place of the imagination way out in the County Galway countryside in the 1920s. Yeah, this was something I discussed in my first book. So my first book was about domestic spaces in Irish poetry, and I looked at this tendency towards these kind of outlying places and cottages, the home from home, as Michael Longley calls it. It enacts a kind of psychic breakage to have this home, this place where you feel more comfortable and more a sense of belonging than your place of origin, because the word home contains a multiplicity of meanings. The word home can mean the place where we're from, it's a place where we belong, but a sense of home also has this sense of safety. It's a place of security. It's where we feel at home. When we describe somewhere as a home from home, it means, oh, I feel as much of a sense of safety and belonging as I do as when I'm at my own home. But also that phrase, a home from home, which Michael Longley uses a lot, it suggests a breakage, that all of a sudden the place of origin is no longer the place of psychic security, of physical safety. Belfast was a dangerous place when Seamus Heaney moved away. Carrigskeewaun represented this place in the countryside, where he was seeing it in the light of the northern fires, but it was way off in the west. That's what Marconi's cottage was for Maeve McGuicken. So in the end, I ended up writing about this tendency as an exemplar of kind of psychic breakage, of the place of origin no longer being a place of belonging. It also, when you move out to the edge, it raises a question. And that question is, when you've moved beyond a place, are you able to have like a clearer vision, one with perspective, one that the peace and being outside of things gives you, can you see things from that great height in perspective? Or are you an irrelevance to them? Have you fled to this escapist other world that therefore obviates anything authentic or insightful your work might have? These questions really bothered all of the poets that we've mentioned in relation to the Troubles. I think that there is a search for perspective and a concomitant fear that what they've actually found is escapism. But yeah, I think that you're right to point out that tendency, because it is odd that they all have these prominent houses of the mind that are nevertheless these kind of cottages way out on the edge.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last question, or are we good? Well, so thank you again, Adam, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you also for coming to Sorbonne Nouvelle this week. It's not over yet, but it has been a real pleasure. And well, we look forward to hearing about your future discoveries when foraging the library, the National Library of Ireland, and finding more things in the Seamus Heaney's treasure trove. So thank you again, Adam.
No, thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening and for the discussion. It's been such a pleasure. It's a real privilege. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.
And so the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So those of you who couldn't be with us tonight will be able to rewatch it later on. So thank you again, Adam, and a very good evening to everyone, and see you all very soon. See you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.